Welcome to Talk World Radio, a half-hour discussion of politics as if the people mattered. I'm David Swanson. This week on Talk World Radio, we are talking about the corporate media with Jeff Cohen, who was an associate professor of journalism at Ithaca College. He founded the Media Watch group FAIR in 1986, co-founded the online activist group rootsaction.org, where I work, in 2011. He is the author of Cable News Confidential, My Misadventures in Corporate Media. He's been a TV commentator at CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, and was senior producer of MSNBC's Phil Donahue primetime show until it was terminated for political reasons 3 weeks before a U.S. invasion of Iraq. His website is jeffcohen.org. Jeff, welcome back to Talk World Radio.
Great to be on with you, David.
So much to talk about in the world of media, none of it good that I know of. Let's talk about the Washington Post to begin with. Outrageous new shameless public policies and some resignations. What's going on?
Yeah, it's pretty naked. At FAIR, beginning in 1986, we traced the influence that media owners had over their news outlets. But it's really gotten bizarre in the last few months. And Musk is the billionaire, third richest person in the world, owns Amazon, and he owns the Washington Post. And he just mandated that on the Washington Post opinion page, they can't ever have a column that doesn't uphold Bezos's two pillars: individual liberties and free markets, is what Bezos says are the two pillars. Obviously, if you don't have health insurance, you don't have a job, you can't afford housing, you can't afford health care, you've gone to college and you're therefore $300,000 in debt, you don't have a lot of individual liberties. I'm assuming Bezos has a little more liberty over his individual person than, half of the country that's struggling. And then the utterly, even more absurd than him saying he's upholding this pillar of individual liberty is his claim that he's upholding the pillar of free market. And as soon as he said that, people started publishing lists of local, state, and federal subsidies to Bezos's companies, to Amazon, to Whole Foods Market, and federal contracts. It's hundreds of millions of dollars. And every year he's getting tax breaks and subsidies from every level of the government while claiming that his newspaper must uphold free markets. There's nothing free market about being a billionaire subsidized by the taxpayers. So what's fascinating, you mentioned, David, resignations. David Shipley, the opinion editor, resigned when he got the word that there can't be a column that opposes Jeff Bezos's two pillars. But we have to remember that a short while ago, David Shipley was doing Bezos's bidding in censoring one of my favorite cartoons of the whole 10-year Trump era. And it was Ann Telnace, Washington Post editorial cartoonist, Pulitzer Prize winner. And I'm looking at it now. I can describe it that she's got these famous billionaires. Bezos is one of them, holding up money bags of dollars on their knees beneath Trump, who's on a pedestal. And at the very bottom, you've got Mickey Mouse, who's basically prostrate on the ground. It's a brilliant cartoon. And David Shipley had not resigned yet. He was doing the censoring, I guess, because he thought Jeff Bezos might be upset that the owner of the Washington Post is portrayed with all these other information and tech owners on their knees giving money bags to Trump. And when Shipley censored the cartoon, he told a lie that everyone in the Washington Post newsroom knew was a lie. He said, this had nothing to do with political bias, said David Shipley, opinion editor of the Washington Post. This was about repetition. We'd already had a column and a cartoon on this very subject. Well, anyone who reads a newspaper knows that sometimes on a single topic over a period of a few weeks, they might have 25 columns, editorials, and cartoons. So it made no sense. Everyone knew it was a lie. David Shipley was lying on behalf of the owner, Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post, and now Shipley's had to resign. So, you know, the old saying from the Reverend in Germany, you know, first they came from the cartoonists, I guess, then they came for the opinion editors. You know, if you don't stand up against tyranny, you will likely find your head on the chopping block next. And that's what's happened.
Yeah, we have to modify it a little bit, though. First, I stood up for the cartoonists, even though I wasn't a cartoonist, but nobody heard me because I didn't own a media outlet, and the discourse is completely controlled. I mean, it's a little bit.
No doubt. And I think it's important you made that point. The gatekeepers of America's information society are tech billionaires who all gave millions of dollars to Trump, and they sat at the front row of the inauguration. That's not normal. Those seats are not usually given to media and tech billionaires and owners. It's usually where governors sit. So we have to understand that while corporations have always controlled news media, progressive and independent and peace-oriented and labor-oriented views have always been shunted into the margins in mainstream media, but something is fundamentally different now. And that's that these owners are transparently giving orders nakedly. You know, most of the media, and as you know, I worked in, and you told your audience in the introduction, I worked in mainstream television news. Usually things are subtle. You know, the people who run a TV network or a newspaper sort of beat around the bush. They don't give you memos, this has to happen or you're out. What's been happening lately is these directives. The LA Times billionaire owner, also born in South Africa, like Musk, you know, he basically vetoed the editorial from his editorial board that was going to endorse Kamala Harris. Jeff Bezos did the same thing at the Washington Post. Then the cartoon was killed. Then he killed the editorial, you know, the opinion page. What you have is just naked, on their knees, obsequiousness. Sometimes it's called, the historians of fascism have called this anticipatory obedience.
Yeah.
But you have these tech and media moguls giving millions and millions of dollars. And the latest in the form of bribery, you like to comment, David, I know that our system of campaign finance is basically a system of bribery. What's been happening in the media is one company after another has been giving bribes to Trump. And the reason that the cartoonist had Mickey Mouse cross-state on the ground is because Disney gave Trump's library, president, it doesn't exist yet, $15 million plus $1 million in legal fees to settle a suit that could not win that Trump had filed against ABC News over something Stephanopoulos had said. You've got Meta just settled for $25 million. They gave it to Trump's, again, non-existent library. because under their own guidelines, you'll remember Meta owns Facebook and Instagram. Under their guidelines, if you incite violence, you get suspended. At least those were the old rules. And after January 6th, when Trump instigated that attempt to stop Biden from, his election being certified on January 6th of 2021, and they suspended him as perfectly right within their guidelines, they've now given Trump $25 million. CBS is about to give that or more on an utterly frivolous suit. So, Trump, there was an article in the Columbia Journalism Review when Trump first ran for president in 2016, where they assigned a reporter, Trevor Tim, to go out and figure out how many times Trump had either sued or threatened to sue a media outlet. And he couldn't do it because it was too often. It was too common. There were suits and threats to sue, and I'm going to sue over and over and over. And it was sort of a joke back in 2016. Now these news outlets are giving Trump bribes so that Trump will give them back subsidies. Why would CBS be considering giving Trump all of this money to his presidential library and his legal fees? 60 Minutes aired a interview with Kamala Harris. 60 Minutes asked her, this is in advance of the 2024 election, asked a question about Netanyahu and pressure on Israel, and she gave a long-winded answer. And in the Face the Nation excerpt, they showed one part of that answer. And then on 60 Minutes, they showed another part of that long-winded answer. And Trump argued that it was a hoax, that they'd given her an answer to a question. He just lied about it. Everyone knows he lied about it. CNN has done 8-minute reports showing how he lied about what 60 Minutes and CBS did. They're about to give Trump another bribe. Why? Because the owner of CBS is Paramount, and Paramount is in merger talks right now that will make the owner of Paramount, Sherry Redstone, perhaps $5, $6, $8 billion if the merger goes through. So giving Trump $25, $50 million in a bribe to settle a lawsuit that's utterly frivolous, that's about to be thrown out of court. But I think they're rushing to settle it before it can be thrown out of court, so they have an excuse for giving the bribe. And so to get back to the
But is it,
beginning
Jeff,
there,
is it in every case, is it approval of a merger or something similar that they're after? Or is it access? Or is it fitting in with the fascist culture of the times? Well, there
I
can be
think
a
in
merger
most,
in each case.
yeah, it's hard. I think in each case, there's a series of factors, and you've hit on a couple. One is to make sure you're in line with the tyrannical president. But in most cases that I've just mentioned, they clearly have a financial stake. They don't want the FCC or the FTC to get in the way of a merger. They want to keep getting contracts from the federal government. Um,
Okay.
the owner of Bezos gets big contracts from the federal government. And so, it's a combination of factors. But at the beginning of FAIR in 1986, I remember journalists would come up to us and said, boy, I like that there's a new group that cares about working journalists, and you're anti-censorship, and you're not against journalism like the right-wing media bashing groups like Accuracy in Media, but you're overstated in your worry about corporate ownership. You don't hear that from any working journalist today. It's
Yeah.
just not spoken of anymore. And in the last few weeks, if a journalist said, "Oh, I don't worry about a media owner spiking me," or they get laughed out of the newsroom. That's how bad it's gotten.
Jeff, what about outlets like the New York Times and CNN that have allowed voices that were explicitly anti-Trump? I mean, I can remember back in the Bush-Cheney era when the New York Times had a policy: you cannot say the president lied. You have to figure out some other way to say it. You cannot have words that are disrespectful of the president in the New York Times. Now you can have them all over the place. Of course, in a limited context from a very weak corporate perspective, but anti-Trump. Is that changing?
I think so. I think there's even been changes at MSNBC, which is seen incorrectly as a left-wing bookend to the right-wing Fox News, which is a joke. They're basically, corporate-owned outlets that have slightly different but pro-corporate viewpoints. And I'll never forget the years that Biden had actually tried to appoint a pretty decent consumer advocate to the Federal Communications Commission. And Fox's lobbyists, working with Comcast lobbyists, they're the owners of MSNBC, they were working hand in hand trying to block this consumer advocate from being appointed to the FCC. You didn't hear about that on MSNBC, the allegedly left-wing channel. But recently at MSNBC, you'll remember they got rid of Mehdi Hassan a year or two ago. He was one of the few advocates for Palestinian rights in the U.S. media. And just recently they announced that Ayman Mohyeldin is losing his show. And Ayman is one of the most progressive voices, and he nearly got killed by the Israelis in 2008 when he was an Al Jazeera reporter inside Gaza. And there's an excellent documentary I encourage your listeners and viewers to watch. It's called The War Around Us, which is about how the Israelis almost killed these journalists from Al Jazeera while they were killing all sorts of other civilians in Gaza. So are there points of view, the New York Times and CNN? I think all of them are worried. The New York Times is less precarious. CNN, owned by Time Warner, they've got all sorts of stakes in making sure that the administration is kind to them. But yeah, I think when we started FAIR in 1986, we warned about this. It's never been worse. And even, people say to me, "You've predicted all of this." And I said, "No, I haven't. It's much worse than I ever predicted. I never thought I would see this kind of naked owners dictating to reporters and editors what they can and cannot do in a public way. And they're almost doing it in public to ingratiate themselves, as you were saying, with the neo-fascistic regime."
One of the things you've predicted and others have predicted for decades is that all this consolidation is going to result in less serious reporting, less actual hardcore journalism, and more fluff and nonsense. I can remember when social media was new, it was mostly little links to serious stuff elsewhere, reports. Now so much of journalism, of reporting, is telling me what somebody said on social media. I mean, it's been flipped over, right? I mean, it's absolute nonsense. I mean, AOC called somebody a mean name, who damn well deserved it, of course. But how is that news?
Yeah, it has flipped. You do see mainstream reporters reporting what social media is saying. In the old days, when there were still thousands and thousands of mainstream reporters that had not yet been fired, social media would be cribbing from mainstream journalists. There's a great book edited by two heroes of media scholarship, Robert W. McChesney and Victor Pickard, and the book title is will the last reporter please turn out the lights? And it describes the thousands and thousands of journalists have been laid off. There are now so many more PR agents working for corporations and government than there are journalists. It used to be sort of a 1-to-1. Now I think it's 4 or 6-to-1. And so what you're really getting through the news media is largely propaganda rather than factual information that's been vetted by a reporter. What we predicted in the 80s and 90s when entertainment conglomerates were taking over news is that as news became a smaller and smaller percentage of what was profiting these entertainment conglomerates, they would make sure that journalism did not interfere with the profits of those companies.
Yeah.
And, within ABC, within the Disney company, ABC News is tiny. And yet Disney went out of its way to settle a suit they were going to win in order to give all this money to Trump.
Yeah.
So we're now at a point way beyond just, news has shrunk and the owners don't care about news. Now they're using their news as a way to pay off the president. ABC did it, Disney did it, and now Paramount is doing it at CBS.
And one of the results, intentional or otherwise, that I noticed from this reporting on what nonsense was emitted from Donald Trump's mouth this morning is that you get big stories across the media, including the Washington Post, on something Donald Trump said he'd do that seems good. Oh, he wants to cut military spending. The Secretary of Defense, has said he wants to slash military spending. While Congress is successfully putting through legislation openly, publicly, but nobody's heard about it, to massively increase military spending, people are paying attention to this opposite thing that Trump said that meant nothing.
Well, again, Fair's critique of the media has been they don't cover policy, they cover noise. And so a soundbite from Trump gets the play, but they can't get into legislation and actually explain to their readers or viewers or listeners, no, it's not happening. Militarism is growing. That's the role that journalists are supposed to play. It's hard to play that role if you work at one of these big corporate outlets. I mean, I'm irritated. I watch, as you know, I force myself to watch the nightly broadcast news, NBC News, Nightly News, CBS Evening News, ABC World News Tonight, PBS NewsHour. If you add it all up, 20, 30 million people a night watch those shows. And I'm just amazed at how they keep telling me that Musk is trying to cut the federal bureaucracy. And they use that word. That's the words that Trump wants them to use.
Yeah.
They want to maintain the charade that, and again, I'm not for bureaucracy in anything, whether it's government or the biggest bureaucracy I've ever had to grapple with, which is the healthcare industry. I believe bureaucracy is horrific for us as individuals. And the way to cut bureaucracy is you do a thorough study. And can this be done more cheaply if we went to this contractor rather than that? But when I hear the mainstream media using exactly the phrase that Trump and Musk wants them to use, which is trimming the federal bureaucracy, it's not what they're doing in any way. Yeah.
We've got just 4 or 5 minutes left. Jeff Cohen, not enough time, obviously, but maybe a few hints. What the hell can we do about it? Because we see it coming, we predict it, we analyze it, and it stomps on our face.
Yeah, I give your listeners and viewers advice, which is support independent media. Build up independent media like Talk World Radio. Build up, independent news outlets because of the internet, and the internet's under threat because Trump is winding down net neutrality. We'll start feeling that soon. But while we have the internet, it's allowed all these news outlets to blossom, including Drop Site News, Lever News, The Intercept, even Salon.com, which is a private company. It's not ProPublica is a nonprofit. There are serious journalists working in nonprofit and independent news outlets, and those outlets don't have millions of dollars for an advertising budget, and they certainly don't have millions of dollars to give bribes to the Trump library that doesn't yet exist. So it's up to us to, as activists, as news consumers, when we see something great in independent media, use your internet, use your email, use your social media to spread the word about that independent outlet and to donate to independent outlets. And that's the only way you fight what's going on now.
Just a couple minutes left, Jeff Cohen, how do we get that message of how to consume media and how to analyze media to people who aren't even looking for it, to people who are just inhaling the worst of the propaganda?
Well, fair.org has always put out helpful hints for how to analyze, how to look for bias, what kinds of biases to look for. You are right that the average person, the working people, are so busy trying to make ends meet that they don't have time. They just let the media wash over them and consume a little bit of news headlines, which are usually wrong.
Or in some cases, express extreme aggravation and bewilderment. How the hell do I know which media outlet is the one to trust?
Yeah. Well, again, it's our role as progressive activists and people that have access to independent media to spread the word to our neighbors, to our relatives. What I do is trades, especially whether it's a Trumpite or it's a relative who's a Zionist, because I'm a Jewish anti-Zionist. Do a trade. I'll read the publication or outlet you want me to consume for a week if you promise to read The Intercept for a week or Drop Site News for a week. That sometimes works when you're doing one-on-one organizing with a relative or neighbor. But again, for the bigger fighting back on the media, delegitimizing the corporate media, you go to fair.org and sign up for their action alerts, or you go to the group that David and I work with that often does media criticism. Go to rootsaction.org and get on their email list, and we can all fight corporate media bias together.
Very well said. And Roots Action has its own media outlet of sorts called progressivehub.net, I believe, that
Yes.
you check out as well. Jeff Cohen, thanks for everything you're doing and for coming on Talk World Radio.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
This is Talk World Radio. I'm David Swanson. Take action at rootsaction.org. Help end war at worldbeyondwar.org. Read or listen to today's Peace Almanac entry at peacealmanac.org. All past shows can be heard at talkworldradio.org. Talk World Radio is produced in Charlottesville, Virginia, and syndicated by Pacifica Network. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.